Jordan Mechner, welcome to the Design Better podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, it's a real honor. We were chatting a little bit before we hit record, before we almost forgot to hit record, I should say. And I didn't know your name at the time, but growing up, you were kind of a hero to me because I grew up in the 80s and 90s, started playing computer games back on the Apple II with it wasn't even a black and white monitor, it's like a black and green monitor. These are things I have to explain to my kids. They're like, what the heck? It doesn't make any sense. But playing Karateka, which I think many people called Karateka back then, loved that game. It was just so different from many of the other Apple games of that era. And then when Prince of Persia came out, my brothers, I have three younger brothers, and I just spent many, many hours playing, exploring that game. And again, it was a sort of paradigm shift because of the way that you created it that just felt so fluid and realistic. And it was just a notch above many other of the games of that era. So maybe we could kind of start back there, because I'm certainly curious about how you taught yourself those skills to build successful games. And I did listen to a few shows that you were in, and you mentioned copying games. And to me, that's interesting because a lot of very well-known artists started copying art to kind of understand the fundamentals and basics. And you kind of copied an asteroids game, as I understand it, to get your starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I really learned programming from, typing programs in BASIC, from books and magazines into the computer and then running them and then modifying them, tweaking them. And then when I got, serious enough about programming to want to really do an ambitious project, in machine language with high-res graphics, my first idea was to just basically knock off the arcade games that I enjoyed playing. Like there was Space Invaders, and then there was Asteroids, and so that was the state of the art for games at the time when I was starting to learn to program games on the Apple II. So yeah, my first really ambitious project was an Asteroids knockoff, and I hoped that I would actually get it published because the most successful game a couple of years before that had been Space Invaders, Apple Invader. And I don't know how they did it, but it was just like the arcade Space Invaders. And so I thought if I can do the same thing with Asteroids, that'll be my ticket. But yeah, what you said before, I think it's really natural starting out in any medium to, especially when you're a kid, to just start by copying the things that you like. I mean, when I was 6 years old and starting to draw my first comics, I drew, Batman and Robin. I drew Walt Disney characters. Just because I wanted to, the things that I really liked and, things that I dug, I wanted to be able to do that.
Storytelling is a big part of what you've done from the beginning too. Is that also something that you found your way into as a kid?
Yeah, I think that storytelling is really the common denominator of all of the media that I've worked in. Making video games for sure, but also screenwriting, writing short stories, and now lately what I'm doing most is writing and now drawing graphic novels, comics, in a way that's bringing me back to the first thing that I tried to do as a kid, which was because I was 13 years old when the Apple II came along. So before that age, I didn't think about programming or making games just because there weren't any. I already loved comics and novels and short stories and movies when this new medium of video games came along. And so it took me a little while to realize that games weren't just fun to play, that this actually was an audiovisual storytelling medium, like movies, like animation. And so those things kind of converged.
You mentioned, again, in this interview, which we'll link out to, but when you're making Karateka, that initially you had the idea that it would sort of be just like a one-on-one karate match, two opponents against each other, but then you realized at some point that building a story would make it much more compelling. What made you realize that?
Yeah, it was interesting. That was really an evolution over a few years from the Asteroids clone to Karateka, and really all of that was in a period of 2 years, from 1980 to 82 when I started designing and programming Karateka. But between the two, after Asteroids, I didn't get published, for the reason that Atari kind of woke up to what was going on, that all of these game publishers were ripping off their coin-op games and selling them on floppy disks. So their lawyers sent threatening letters, including to the publisher that I'd already signed a contract with that was going to publish my Asteroids, and so they backed down as that was sort of an industry-wide shift. So I was like, all right, can't do the arcade games, I'll do an original game. And so the first original game that I came up with was called Death Bounce. It was basically Asteroids, but instead of shooting at space rocks that wrapped around the edges of the screen, you were shooting at these bouncing colored billiard balls. It was kind of a combination of Asteroids and pool. And I sent that to Broderbund, which was my favorite software publisher. They had published Apple Galaxian. It was one of the first, full-color, high-res machine language games, which had, totally blew me away. And it was a, best-selling Apple game at the time. So I sent them Death Bounce, and Doug Carlston, one of the founders of Broderbund, called me back and said, this is a very well-programmed game, but this kind of, arcade-style shoot-'em-up game is a little bit last year. The game that we're having the biggest success with right now, Choplifter, it has a more engaging story, and he sent me a copy of Choplifter, and did you play it at the time? This was 1982.
I did, yeah. I love that game too. Yeah.
How old were you, by the
fun.
way, in 1982?
So I was born in '76. So yeah, I was 6 years old, I guess. Yeah, I'm doing the math right there.
Yeah.
I was young,
so
for sure.
So I was a full decade older, and Choplifter, when I played it, it really impressed me, because it had smooth graphics. You're flying a helicopter trying to rescue hostages. It was basically a kind of a pixelated version of the hostage crisis, that had happened a few years earlier. And so you're flying this helicopter around in the desert, trying to rescue these people, and they were little, like 8 pixels high, but they were running, and they would wave to you like, "Hey, come save me." And if you missed them and they got squashed or blown up, you kind of felt bad, like, oh, he was counting on me and I didn't save him. And so that really impressed me, that even though they were just pixels on a screen, I was feeling, emotionally engaged, kind of a little attachment to these characters, as if I were playing a movie. And plus the smooth scrolling, the kind of almost like it was kind of a multi-plane scrolling effect. Of course, the Apple II version that was possible with 1982 technology, but still, it felt cinematic to me. And so I thought, okay, we don't have to be copying arcade games. We can make games that are, really using the fact that this is a computer, because all the arcade games were oriented towards getting high scores, to get an extra man, an extra ship, and the idea was to get people playing forever, just putting in quarters, addicted to the game. You don't want the game to ever end. You want to make as much money from it as possible. That was the coin-op publisher's idea. But with a game on the Apple II, the customer has already bought the game on a floppy disk. And so this, Choplifter was actually a self-contained experience. It was a story which could have an end. There were 64 hostages, and once if you got a perfect score, you rescued all of them, and then it said "the end" on the screen, not game over, and go on to the next more difficult level, just "the end," as if you had successfully reached the end of a story. And so that kind of opened my eyes to the fact that a game, you could have a game that would also tell a story at the same time, and that would have a cinematic feel, and that would engage players emotionally the way that an animated movie did. And so that led to Choplifter led to Karateka, which was that took me 2 more years to actually bring that game to completion. I was in college at the time. I was 18 when I started, and 20 years old when it shipped in 1984. And in the course of developing Karateka, it kind of started out like 2 guys fighting, in karate outfits, fighting each other on a mat, getting points. And then it sort of became more and more story-based, and all of the things that didn't contribute to the story, I kind of cut out along the way until it was just this very clean, there was no score, there were no numbers, there were no extra lives. It's just, you're in this situation, your true love has been kidnapped by the evil warlord who's taken her to his mountain castle, and you have to fight your way into the fortress, save her, and be reunited. That's the story. And by the time it was finished, I had sort of kept doubling down on that cinematic aspect, using rotoscoping to create the animation. My dad composed music for the game, and most Apple II games at that time didn't have music, but he would play the music on Steinway piano, and then I would transcribe the note values, into byte values. There was cross-cutting and scrolling, and so it was really like a little interactive animated movie.
This is what you're describing is amazing. It's kind of hard for maybe younger folks to understand how little what you're describing that you're doing was documented. It's not like you would go get there weren't so many books, or there was no web that you would go get to learn this stuff. So you're figuring this out on your own. Clearly a very passionate and curious person. Also fascinating that your dad's involved, and want to talk about that. But I don't know, could you tell us a little bit about like what you were like at this age, and then what success early on did for you or did to you? Because that is also very unique to be so devoted and so successful at a young age.
Well, those are, okay, two different and interesting questions. Yeah, so I was a freshman in college, at this point. And, like most 17, 18-year-olds, I was kind of worried about what I was going to do in life and was I going to be successful at it. So I'd always wanted to tell stories and make animated movies. I had grandiose fantasies of becoming a film director, like George Lucas or Walt Disney. But then I would think, but that's completely unrealistic. What are the odds that I would ever succeed in that? I should, do something more practical. And programming seemed like a skill that, well, at least I could, get a job doing that. But I wasn't really interested in programming for its own sake. I'd never been a particularly technical kind of kid. Like I didn't really know how a radio worked or how a car worked or any of that. I was more into like art and drawing and telling stories and writing fiction. That was kind of, my passion. And so the computer came along, and that kind of, it just hooked me because the computer was a way to make interactive animated movies, whereas the animated movies that I was making with Super 8 film at the time, weren't really impressing anybody. They certainly wouldn't impress any adults, that you could see that a kid had made it. But when I made games on the Apple II, because it was so new, the technology was so new, and the art form was so new, I felt like my games were approaching the quality of what I saw in the stores, the computer stores at that time, selling games on floppy disks in Ziploc bags, which progressed over the next couple of years to cardboard boxes. And so this feeling of being on the forefront of something new was exciting to me. And because I was in college and I sort of had all of these other influences, like I read very widely, like I was into classical music, I was into art and art history, and then world history, politics, all of these. I was pretty voracious in what I was reading, and I was obsessed with movies, by the way. So at the time that I was in college, programming these games, Death Bounce and Karateka, instead of going to classes, the other thing I was doing instead of going to classes was seeing movies, like hundreds and hundreds of movies at the college film societies, which we would project on 16mm film. So I think that if Karateka was different from other games on the Apple II at that time, it's partly because my influences were so different. I had played the other Apple II games that were out there, but programming in itself and other kinds of games like tabletop games and strategy games, that wasn't really where I was coming from. I was more interested in movies and film, and the visual look of Karateka was informed by like Japanese woodblock prints. And that would, like I knew about Hokusai and the Mount Fuji, print that was Yeah, I mean, I literally stole his Mount Fuji and kind of, in a low res pixel form. That's the background of Karateka. So, and then
You would not be the first nor the last to lift the
yeah,
Hokusai Mount Fuji.
yeah. And getting back to my dad, I think that's interesting too, because he was even further from the world of video games than I was. I mean, he was European. He was born in Vienna in 1931, and he was a research psychologist before becoming an entrepreneur. So he was a classical pianist, and he had done oil painting. He played chess. He was very much from that old world. And so here, his son has this Apple II computer, which is this new thing. But he sort of got right away that this was something new. And so when I would come home for the school breaks, I would show him what I was doing, and he would look at it. And although he never played a game in his life, and still hasn't to this day, he actually contributed many ideas. Like, for example, he was the one who said, this is like a little movie, but it doesn't have music. Wouldn't it be more dramatic if you could add music to it? And my first answer was like, yeah, it would be. That would be nice. But look, the Apple II has this little tiny speaker, and all I can do is make it click. And I have to freeze the animation to get a click out of it. The technology is not really there yet. And he said, well, but your game has beeps. The beeps all have different tones. It's like, yeah, because if you toggle the speaker at different frequencies, you can change the pitch. So he said, well, if you play a series of beeps of different pitches, that's music, right? And so we kind of worked on it and figured out the note, the values from 0 to 255 that corresponded to the notes, and then he actually, composed the music for Karateka. And his references were, like Wagner operas, with the leitmotif approach, where you have a love theme and a hero theme and a villain theme. So while I was, ripping off asteroids, and he was ripping off Wagner, all of these influences combined. And I think the fact that there were such weird and diverse sources of inspiration kind of combined to create something that was new at the time.
I just need to pause here and say, like, that is fucking amazing. That is very cool. That is very cool.
Super cool. And we'll get to this book in just a minute, because it's very relevant to what you're saying about your dad. But I just want to, while we're still on the topic of your early career, let folks know that you journaled a lot of what you did, creating both Karateka and Prince of Persia. And that's actually, I first got to know about you. I think it was actually on John August's podcast, who's a screenwriter. He mentioned this book, The Making of the Prince of Persia. And it's just a wonderfully done book. Lots of like illustrations and photos and screen captures of your work. And it just, obviously for me, there's a lot of nostalgia, which is part of what attracted me, but just also kind of getting a peek into your creative process, throughout, as you sort of evolved as both a game designer and later getting into film and your graphic novels. It was just really wonderful. And you don't often get that with a lot of artists. I mean, one person that comes to mind who did something somewhat similar is Brian Eno. He has it's called, I think, a diary with swollen appendices, and it's a journal like of his day-to-day work. It's really good. Yeah, it's worth checking out. And he talks about writing with or working with U2 and many of the other artists he's known for working for. So that there's some similarities there. But what caused you to think of like, man, I should journal what I'm doing from a very young age, or did you just kind of stumble upon it?
I mean, keeping a journal is something that I had sort of done off and on, like throughout my childhood and early teenage years. But I always, at a certain point, I would look at what I'd written and then I would just be embarrassed and I would throw it out, because like I don't, when I was 13, I was like, oh God, I don't want to read this juvenile stuff that I wrote when I was 11, and so I had stopped and started. I don't really know what made it stick. That this journal that I started a few months into my freshman year of college, but I'm sure a big thing was that my roommate Ben Normark was keeping a journal, and he had been doing that for a long time. And I saw he was writing in his journal at the end of every day, and that impressed me. And so I thought, oh, that's real discipline. And he's been doing it for a long time, so he has this record of his, of high school and all of the things he thought and felt, and how his friendships evolved. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to do it too. And I think on the first page, I was like, all right, my goal is to basically just keep it up and to not throw it out when is to not destroy it, when I get fed up with it. And I never thought I was going to show it to anybody. I certainly never thought I was going to publish it. This was just something I was doing for myself. And I mean, it was about something like 20 years later when by then, I was much older and I felt distant enough from my teenage self that I was like, it was because it was just coincidence that the period when I started keeping this journal coincided with creating Karateka and then Prince of Persia, on the Apple II, which, by that point, by 2010, I realized, okay, this is actually sort of a piece of a period in computer history and video game history that's gone. And so this is a valuable record of that time and how, how these games were made and how and also just what the world was like, what the industry was like, and that it could maybe be interesting for for young game developers, but also for anybody in a creative field to read. Because I was always interested in reading journals by creators. There aren't that many of them at this time in the 80s when I was in college, when I was making Karateka, or maybe it was a little bit later by then I was doing Prince of Persia. I remember reading Steven Soderbergh's journals of the making of Sex, Lies, and Videotape. And he was young too. He was, an indie filmmaker who had just had this big success. And he published his journal of the making of the movie, which is, with all of the things that go wrong and all of the frustrations and the pain. And I mean, I devoured that because I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wanted to be an independent filmmaker and make a movie like Sex, Lies, and Videotape. So to see how he did it and also what he'd been up against, that was just gold, such valuable information. I mean, there are other journals. Michael Palin of Monty Python kept journals, and they're not, you can find them, and they're great. It's because he goes from just, before Monty Python to doing Monty Python to having it be this huge, insane success and how that changed all of their lives, and then all of the people are in there. So I just love this. It's just raw information. It's not like a biography where somebody kind of is interpreting their life and shaping it in such a way that they, then I learned this lesson, and they always, a journal is just like what they wrote while it was happening at the end of the day, and it's unfiltered. So, it was pretty easy to make the decision to take, not all of my journals, but the parts that were about game design and filmmaking and sort of my creative evolution, and publish them.
One thing that's interesting about journaling is that it sort of creates a facsimile of yourself, where you can look at it and it is you, and also it doesn't feel like you because the self is constantly evolving. I wonder if, looking back at those journals, if there was anything that you learned about the way that you learn or the way that you make that you might not have seen had you not journaled.
Absolutely, and it's an ongoing learning process. I mean, I think I started learning from my journals, while I was keeping them, because like sometimes I would read what I'd written 3 months earlier, and even in my journal, like there's moments where I say, God, I just reread my entry from last June when I was doing this, this, and that. What was I thinking? I should have done this. Or the journal reminded me that the whole reason I got into this was because, and so you can actually have insights by kind of having this dialogue with an earlier version of yourself. And that could be like 3 months earlier, or 3 years earlier, or 30 years earlier. I mean, one of the things that, it's funny reading the journals now because I was so young. But then there's, there are things that I said that strike me as naive, but also touching. And in a way, it's a way to check in with ourselves. It's almost like a message. Writing in a journal is like sending a message to us in the future, and reading it is like getting a message from us in the past. And as you say, there's a kind of a persona that develops when you're writing a journal, because it's a little performance. It's like writing a letter. If you read the correspondence, not so much these days because now it's all about, it's so easy to pick up the phone and we have text, but like in the early 20th century, and before, you can read these long epistolary conversations between people back and forth and writing these letters. And so you can see how they're expressing their views and their, there's a whole thing that happens, they're feeding off of each other. And so reading, reading what I wrote in my journal, it's almost like I'm sitting down at the end of the day to talk to somebody. And some people actually do that when they keep a journal, right? Anne Frank, in her journal, she called it, she invented an imaginary friend, and so every entry says, "Dear Kitty." Mm-hmm. Like she's consciously talking to someone who doesn't exist, but who this kind of ideal listener comes into being through the act of writing a journal every day. After a few years, sitting down to write in your journal, it's like you just click into it, and it's as if you're writing to that friend. Of course, the friend is, it's whoever reads it. It could be you years later, it could be somebody else, it could be somebody you've never met long after your death. But it's I think it's valuable to kind of develop that voice, because in a way it's the voice of us talking to ourselves, but in a constructive way.
Are you still journaling today?
I do. It's evolved for. There was one period when I stopped. From about 2000 to 2004, I didn't write a journal at all. I was having kids, and I'd just gotten married, and it just couldn't find those minutes at the end of the day. I just kind of ended it. Then, actually, after I got divorced, I was suddenly I had time alone at the end of the day again, and also I was getting divorced. My kids were small, so I started writing in the journal again. And that time, since then, I've continued in different forms. For a while, I started, about 15 years ago, I started drawing and sketching from life a lot in notebooks. It wasn't a journal, but it was kind of a sketch journal, because I would draw things, that were happening around me, funny things that the kids would say, or, just drawing people in cafes, at game developers conferences, things like that. And so then in my private journal, my written journal, I started mixing in sketches as well. So today I still keep a journal, but I use something called a hobonichi. It's a wonderful design object, actually. And actually, since your podcast is about design, maybe your listeners would be interested. Techo hobonichi, made in Japan. They come in all different sizes, but I use the sort of these small black ones that have 1 page per day. So it's an entire year that fits into the palm of your hand. So the fact of just having 1 page maximum kind of keeps it short. I'm not going to write 10 pages at the end of a day, like I did, when I was 20. But I do write every day, something at the end of the day, and sometimes I draw. And so it's great because you can basically have 15 years of your life in a shoebox.
Very compact. The drawing is a really good segue to your new graphic novel, Replay. I happened to snag a copy on Amazon. It said it was the last hardcover copy, so you should probably restock because it's really wonderful. When I got it, I wasn't sure if you were the illustrator, and then it became clear that you were. And I really love the illustration style. It's very it's simple, but there are it's sort of simple characters interspersed with really nice kind of architectural renderings almost, and it's great. Let's kind of frame it in the story of your father too, who, as we touched on, he escaped from Nazi Germany, I believe, with your aunt. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
And then he had this amazing career. At 19, he was a concert pianist. He painted portraits. He was a chess master. So he's clearly a polymath. So maybe you come by that part of it naturally. And then this little detail, and you can confirm this or not, because sometimes Wikipedia is inaccurate. It says that he was he did scientific research, and he funded it. It sounds like with some entrepreneurial ventures, founding the company that created the first chyrons, would be the little things that go down Chiron. across the. Is that true?
Yeah, Chiron was one of my dad's ventures. He's had he's done so many things. I could spend an hour, fill the podcast just talking about all the various things my dad has been into. But yeah, he was a child in he was 7 years old in 1938 at the moment of the Nazi Anschluss of Austria, and so like all Jewish families, his family had to flee Austria, to try to save their lives, and he was separated from his parents, and for a few years during which World War II happened, and his parents, my grandparents had made it to Cuba, where they spent a couple of years, because they couldn't yet get, they wanted to go to New York, but they couldn't get a visa, to enter the U.S. It was very hard to immigrate to European countries or to the U.S. At that time, like now, most of the Western countries just weren't really eager to accept immigrants or refugees. But he was with his aunt and a young woman and her 7-year-old nephew in occupied France, and so they just, he had told me about their adventures, all of the unlikely, kind of incredible and often very touching and also ironic events that enabled them to stay alive, and so to make it to the U.S. He arrived around age 10, and a happy ending for him and his parents and his aunt. They all made it, that little nuclear family. But of course, most of their their cousins and aunts and uncles, the rest of the family, and the whole world they had known was wiped out by the Holocaust. So I kind of grew up knowing that was the background, and feeling like a great contrast to my own very safe, pleasant American childhood, where I was able to play Space Invaders and get an Apple II computer and draw comics and things like that. Yeah, so doing this book, Replay, was an idea that kind of grew on me. I wanted to do some kind of story or memoir about my dad's childhood adventures, and also about my and his father had been he grew up in that old what Stefan Zweig calls the world of yesterday, that Central Europe of the early 1900s, this sort of nostalgic golden era of that was wiped away by the First World War in 1914 to 1918. And that, of course, was also the setting for my 1990s adventure game, The Last Express, which is set on board the Orient Express on the last journey across Europe right before World War I breaks out and destroys that world forever. I wanted to do something along the lines of a memoir, and the idea of writing and drawing it as a graphic novel, I think I wouldn't have thought of doing that a few years earlier, but because I had been sketching from life, in my sketch journal, and sort of getting better at it over the years, but by the time that I, was really ready to do Replay, and as I tell in the book, it's a moment when I had moved to Europe. I had actually come here to do a new Prince of Persia video game project, which ended up getting canceled. But the cancellation of that project kind of gave me an open space to decide, what do I want to do next? And I decided what I wanted to do next was to do this family story. And I knew it would take me a couple of years, but I thought that my drawing ability had gotten just to the point where I felt able to tackle it. And it was definitely an ambitious project. It was really at the outer limits of my abilities, and I knew I would kind of have to level up several times, while I was doing it. But it was a really, really meaningful and enjoyable project for me, and I feel like along with Prince of Persia and some of the video games, I think Replay is maybe the most important work that I've done.
It's a beautiful book. It's an interesting story too. I'm curious why the timing for that book. Was there something in particular that you felt like you wanted to capture? And your dad's been a collaborator and involved in so much of your career. I wonder if there was something there too with your dad and being able to connect with him through this book.
Yeah, I think most important decisions, even if we have reasons for them, the most important reasons are probably hidden from us. They're probably unconscious. But I think, probably the fact that I was able to talk to my dad and ask him questions. And it was during the confinement of COVID, that I was, from in 2020, 2021, that I was in France writing and drawing this book. And my dad and most of my family was back in New York, and it wasn't so easy to travel back and forth. So doing this book actually gave me a great reason to pick up the phone and talk to my dad for hours and ask him about his his life and his childhood. And of course, I needed the information in order to draw these panels accurately. So I wanted to know like what different places looked like, and how they what kind of clothes people were wearing. The German Luftwaffe pilot that he and his aunt were friends with in Le Touquet, during the in the first months of the war when France was occupied and the Luftwaffe was using this French seaside town that they were staying as an airbase to invade England. So I was curious, this Luftwaffe officer, like, what kind of a cap did he have? What kind of uniform did he have? Because I needed to draw him. And so in trying to remember these details, my dad would remember other things. And then I was doing my own research on the side, looking, trying to talk to historians and find old photos and postcards and newsreel footage so that I could draw these things accurately. Sometimes I would find things and I would tell him or show him, and that would trigger a memory, something that he hadn't thought about for years. And it was really quite wonderful when my research would turn up something that confirmed something that he'd remembered but hadn't been sure if he was remembering it, because he was only a kid. Was it really true? And then when the research confirmed that this memory that he'd had, of something that happened when he was 9 years old, was accurate, it was very powerful and moving, I think, for him as well. I mean, he's now 94 years old, and I'm very happy that he's still, got all of his faculties, and he really enjoyed, both the conversations, but also reading the book, Replay. And so I was happy to do it, while my dad could help and also can appreciate it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Really wonderful. So there's a short passage in the book Replay about letting go of the past success and moving on, and I'm curious about that because you do mention kind of jokingly that your kids, when you were talking about doing another Prince of Persia thing, they're like, "Dad, another Prince of Persia." But was that challenging for you, knowing that obviously you'd had other successes, you'd worked on other things, but that idea of like, okay, it's time to let go of this and try to do this now?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's it's a double-edged blessing, to create something that is so loved that people just want more of it. I mean, it's great. That's what we hope for, right? When when I do a book or a game, I hope it will be successful, that there'll be a big audience for it. But once that happens, it's kind of a trap, because you can't just keep repeating yourself, even if people want more of the same, only not exactly the same. That's not a great attitude for a creative person. If something was good to begin with, it's probably because we gave ourselves the freedom to create something new. We didn't know, going in that that this is the thing that was going to have the success. So my attitude with Prince of Persia has always been, I'm grateful, for its success. I'm grateful for all of the doors it's opened and for the love that the fans have for it. And now that it's been so long, it's been, Prince of Persia has had its 35th anniversary this year, and it's had so many iterations. There was the Sands of Time with Ubisoft, 20 years ago. There was the movie, which John August, by the way, who can thank for being on this podcast. That's so cool that you found out about the Prince of Persia journals from listening to his script notes, which is, I love that podcast.
It's a great show too.
Yeah, John was the
quick sidebar there for folks. Oh yeah, go. I'll sidebar and hand it back to you.
Totally recommend John August and Craig Mazin's Script Notes podcast, and also John, by the way, has just released a new game, an app called Alpha Birds, based on a card game. Yeah, John also is a polymath who does all kinds of things. He was also the executive producer of the Prince of Persia movie in 2010, and then of the 2012 Karateka remake. And everything John does is quality. So, yeah, check out his site, people who don't know about him. What were we talking about?
Yeah, so we were just kind of going through, sort of trajectory. We started it with like, kind of letting go of past successes. But maybe it's interesting to dip a little bit into the screenwriting, because that was sort of one of your early goals, was to get involved in film, and you did actually become kind of a co-writer, the original writer of what became the Prince of Persia movie. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit too.
Right. So I mean, just to wrap up the question that you'd asked before, about if is the success of Prince of Persia, a trap? And I feel it's actually maybe I already answered that one. And sorry.
No,
it's all good. It's all good.
Yeah.
You
right. Yes.
You have said.
Yeah.
Go ahead if you've got more you want to add.
I'm trying to remember, where was I on that complicated track that I had launched onto?
So I think Eli was asking about, you talk about it in Replay, the idea of letting go of past success and moving on. So I don't know if you have anything more to say about that, just like how you think about success and how it can be enabling and also limiting with creativity, creative expression. If there's anything more you want to say on that.
Yes. So like a success, like the success that Prince of Persia had, or that, then the Sands of Time had after that, is double-edged, because it opens doors, it creates opportunities, but it also creates expectations. And so I think caving into the kind of the pressure to try to repeat a success or build on it in a way that people will like usually is not a good idea. That doesn't usually lead to great creative work. So I think it's very important to keep the freedom that was what made it possible to make that thing in the first place, and just apply it to the next thing, whatever it is. And I think to fixate too much on, wow, is my next game going to be as successful as the last one? It's not helpful to think that way. Really, every project is its own thing. And of the games that I've done, the books and the screenplays and graphic novels, if you do the numbers, some of them have sold like orders of magnitude more than others. Prince of Persia, obviously. But that doesn't mean that the others are less worthy or less important or less successful. I think for an artist, it's important to have your own internal metric of success, which is, it's like, why am I doing this? What do I want to achieve, or what do I want to communicate? And if something works, if it lands the way that we wanted, it can bring delight to an audience of thousands, or an audience of millions, or an audience of hundreds. But in each case, you're communicating with one person who's going to, hopefully discover this thing that you've made or worked on and appreciate it. And if they appreciate it in the way that you hoped, if it's meaningful for them, that's a success. And so it's, you can multiply it by however many units or copies or whatever, but in each case, it's a one-on-one encounter between the creator or the team that created it and the person who's going to experience it. So in a way, you can't get any more than that. It's always, I feel like I'm always making whatever I'm making, I'm always making it for one person. I don't know who, but this kind of imaginary audience, is out there, and that's what I'm making all of these things for.
Jordan, one thing that's I'm struck by in your career and your work is that from the outside, it seems like you approach everything on your terms. And just to press the rewind button here on your life story, that as a young person becoming excited about stories and video games and learning that thing and sort of teaching yourself, following your curiosity, which leads you into multiple video games, script writing, filmmaking, graphic novels. It seems like you're always operating and moving through life on your own terms. Is that accurate? Is there a philosophy or an approach that you think about in terms of your work, how one makes a living and pursues one's interests and the life that you want to live?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, and I've been lucky to have the chance to do things on my own terms. And that's, going back to Karateka, when I was 20 years old, the year that I finished college, and graduated, that's the time in life when usually you're like, okay, how am I going to live? I'm going to get a job. What kind of a job can I get? And because I had just published this game that was a bestseller and was bringing in royalties, where I was 20 years old and I didn't have to get a job. I could actually, I had the luxury of thinking, okay, well, what do I want to do? Because the royalties are going to fund me for the next few years. I could get a job. I could, if I wanted to go to film school, because I was also dreaming of becoming a filmmaker. That was one possible path. But making another game was appealing too, because I felt like, after making Karateka, I had all these ideas, and games were, I had met all the people at Broderbund and other people in the game development industry, and I kind of wanted to do that. So having the luxury to choose for the right reasons, and not just because, this is the best, among so-so options that I have at the moment. It's a chance that so few people get in life. So I think I was really lucky to be the age that I was, to have that first success with Karateka, which then gave me the freedom to do, what ended up being Prince of Persia, and which basically, since then, one opportunity has led to another, and I've never had to say, okay, I hate this project or I hate this job, but I have to take it. And I know how rare that is, and I'm very grateful for that.
One other realization that you had, it seemed pretty early on, and I read this in your Prince of Persia journal. I think it was during a phase where you had created and released Prince of Persia, and it had a lot of really good reviews, like 5-star reviews across the board. It got nominated for awards and things like that, but it did not yet have any commercial success. And I think that in itself is interesting, because it just shows that like really great art or games, even if it's critically recognized, doesn't mean it's going to make a lot of money or lead to other stuff in your career necessarily. But putting that aside, you wrote that the most important thing you realized is working with people you like. That really resonated with me, because I've done a number of things over my career, some entrepreneurial, some working for companies. And it was always the case that even if the thing I was working on was not something I was super passionate about, if I was like the people I was with, it just made all the difference. And now I feel like I'm in the fortunate situation of both doing work I like and working with somebody, Aaron here, who I really love working with. So you can hopefully eventually get in that career where you have both. But yeah, just tell us a little bit about that and that realization and how that affected you.
Yeah, well, that's of all the lessons that I've learned, and you mentioned that I kind of had that realization and wrote it in my journal. I think that's probably the one that I would most wish that I could go back and tell my younger self, and and I tell it to young people now, because we're so fixated, and I was fixated on having the thing that I'm working on at the moment be what I hope, having it be a success, and what's that going to lead to, and then the people around us, publishers, the people that we have to apply to for funding, team members, colleagues, people that we can learn from, people that we hire, journalists, who we speak to. Like, we tend to see those people through the lens of how are they going to help me make this thing a success. But aside from all that, like, these are people, and every person that we meet, that's important. That's an encounter. And with the hindsight of looking back over 50 years, like, whatever the reasons and the things that were on our mind 30, 40, 50 years ago for that particular project were at the time, they're long since in the past. But that person and whatever relationship, friendship or collaboration we've had, that person has only gained in importance, and we sort of meet the same people more than once in different contexts. The roles that we play in life change, our life situation changes, but and at a certain point we think, wow, the people that I know, the people that I've worked with, that's the real value. That's what really matters the most. So the thing that I would tell younger me is just really pay attention to the people, and don't take them for granted. Just give each encounter and each person, the value that it deserves.
I love that. That's great. Jordan, what have you been listening to, watching, that has you looking at the world and thinking about things differently?
Well, I've kind of been on a tear this last few weeks. I don't know why, but I started reading Stefan Zweig. He wrote a wonderful memoir called The World of Yesterday, and I'd read it years ago, but I think I kind of wanted to read it again, partly because of replay and because of having, because it's, that world of Vienna and Central Europe in the early 20th century was also my grandfather's world. So I reread it. He's a wonderful writer. He also wrote short stories, and he wrote many, many books, but The World of Yesterday is really great. And it just struck me how it almost felt like he was writing it today, because he's talking about the impact of technological change and how the world got so much faster. And he's talking about like 1905. But everything he says, it's like, that's how I feel. That's how I felt about the iPhone. That's how I felt about the internet. That's how I feel about AI. But he's writing it about the telephone and the technological innovations of his day. But he's so precise and observant about describing like emotional states and psychological states and the way kind of the way that people relate to each other and how they feel. I'm like, okay, he's writing an instruction manual for today, and it's just wonderful. Of course, unfortunately, he was also writing like right before this wonderful world of yesterday destroyed itself in two terrible world wars. World War I, a short break, and then Nazism and World War II. And he, of course, like most of the people he knew, had to flee and live in exile. Many of them didn't survive. Hearing the echoes too of all the political events that he's describing in 1914 and in the 1930s, and seeing the parallels with today is also is a little bit disquieting. But the book is also it's also inspiring and kind of I got a lot out of it. So I read Stefan Zweig, and then that led me to a book called it's a new book called Vienna: How the City of Ideas Created the Modern World by Richard Cockett, and that's the book that I'm reading right now. I think I'm about halfway through. Yeah, right at the beginning, when we got on the Zoom, you mentioned that your podcast is kind of about the cross-pollination between different artistic fields and different aspects of creation, and so this book about Vienna it's really about that too, about the Wiener Werkstätte in the early 20th century, and how architecture and politics and music and art all kind of inspired each other, and how there was a whole group of people who were all kind of dissolving the boundaries between these different forms and disciplines, like science and medicine, music, that had previously been very traditionally delineated, and now at this point kind of started to all kinds of new ideas, modernism started to be created. So that's a book that so far I'm very much enjoying.
Great. One more bonus question before we completely wrap up here. This is for the game nerds amongst us, and I have to admit I don't do as much gaming as I used to. I play with my kids some stuff occasionally, and then like casual stuff. Are there, and you answered a portion of this question on another show, and I'll point to that, where you talked about like the 5 games you would have on your perfect console, and it also
Oh my gosh.
tied to your own history of gaming. But if you're looking at the games right now, are there any games or game designers out there that you find particularly inspiring?
Well, this is the obvious place to plug Prince of Persia, the Lost Crown, which was made by a team in Montpellier, which I really, really enjoyed playing this year. And I'm not usually a Metroidvania player, but I really like that one. It's a beautiful game. And I mean, I've already talked about, how much I've, been inspired by the games of Fumito Ueda. Ico was a formative influence, on me and on the team in making Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. And there's just an atmosphere and kind of a unique spirit about those games that that's always that I've always connected with.
Awesome. Well, Jordan Mechner, thanks so much for being on Design Better. Oh, you know what? Let me cut that for a second. Jordan, where can folks find out more about you and your work?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. So I have a website, jordanmechner.com, and the landing page there has links to like archives of like the making of my past games, and also about the current projects, the graphic novels, replay, and I haven't mentioned the other books, Monte Cristo, and Templar and Liberty, but all of those, the old and the new projects, are at jordanmechner.com. And they're at the bottom of the landing page are also links to a email newsletter that I do every month or two. And there's an RSS feed and my links to various social media, Blue Sky, Mastodon, and so forth.
Awesome. Well,
Fantastic.
Jordan Mechner, say, go ahead, Aaron. Were you going to wrap?
You got it. Go for it.
Jordan, thanks so much for being on Design Better.
Well, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Cool.
And it's fun to watch the sun go down behind you there.
Yeah, I would have turned on a light, but yeah, I can see there's.
All good. Yeah, that's great. Are you in Paris?
I'm in Paris at the moment, yeah.